Today is August 18th, 2023. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche, Chestokom Aki, or Dekots Nogo Tine Siku. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders have been kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Marina Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce it in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to as the land of the Hare people. I am a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mokinstis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name that has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act Imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellow Knives Dene, which puts me in Treaty 8. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having a Canadian Indian Act Imposed status card, which is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ community and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socioeconomic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share my journey. As a Dene woman who has attempted to run for harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow for incarceration, a denial of justice, the denial of healthcare services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples, I have worked to continue reports to advocate for and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today as we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for the so-called country named Canada. I see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and as a treaty partner. Pride Month should never just be 1 month. It's important to understand it was the straight agenda and gendered violence that was and is forced on these lands by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. It's important your land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage everyone to introduce themselves with an acknowledgement of their ancestors, stories of displacement, how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement, so we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you won't pronounce your local Indigenous nations' names, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, economic oppression, or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves a native Calgarian or whatever town you're from, you show me that you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Winty's book Unreconciled or so many other Indigenous authored books actually explain these ideas and concepts. Land back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism, but it would be a part of a treaty partnership, part of meaningful reconciliation, and honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, Pagani of the Confederacy. These lands are now Treaty 7, signed in 1877 with signatures that, of course, are the Blackfoot Confederacy, and now the Stoney Nations and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening and watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. Also, giving a review helps, whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. So I'm honored to have a friend back, and I'll let her introduce herself in her way.
Thank you, Michelle. My name is Marina Crane, and I'm from Tsuut'ina. I was born in Sioux Valley, Manitoba, and I have 8 great-grandparents and 4 grandparents that have the Dakota background. What else? I've grown up going to school in the city of Calgary, with non-Indigenous people. And so, Michelle, a lot of times when you're talking about the inherent rights of Indigenous people and just the systemic racism, I didn't know how unique I was until I started talking to non-Indigenous people in the city of Calgary. And the reality of it is I tell a lot of other Indigenous people, I grew up with different types of non-Indigenous people. City people are different than rural people. And so for me, when I address myself as Tsuut'ina, it's a place where I've grown up, and a place where I help people, and also from birth to death. And I think a lot of times when it comes to being an Indigenous woman, I think a lot of times feminism gets caught up, only because when we're here, we never we live and we die here. Mm-hmm. And so anything that happens to a woman, it stays with us throughout our lives. We don't leave. Whereas in the city, urban Indians, Indigenous people, they can move. There's no consequences to their actions. So when you asked me if I wanted to be public, I said yes. Mm-hmm. Only because when my blog came out, I became anonymous. And so for the first couple of years, I went on WordPress, and then I switched to Google. Because I switched to Google, I started getting more feedback, and I didn't realize the impact. I did have some training in computers earlier. So as old as I am, I'm 71 years old. When I first met Nathan Chasinghorse, I was 54. Mm-hmm. And prior to that, when I was 30, I worked in the state hospital for Utah, looking after high-risk teenage girls, 24/7 suicide watch. Mm. And I studied psychology in the States. And in the process of studying psychology, and again, out of my community, out of my country, in a totally different environment, I truly believe that helped me heal. Mm. And because of that, I empowered myself to look at my own psychological makeup. And a lot of times when, without knowing it, I was bonding to mental health workers. The colonial system, white is right. And I shouldn't have, but yet at the same time, I don't regret it, but I also say to people, if you want to go to therapy, go to therapy. I'm not saying that it didn't help me. I just think that 17 years ago, and even 50 years ago, there were not that very many Indigenous therapists or people working in the field of mental health. And I was director of education in Tsuut'ina, and I needed some cross-cultural help. So I sought out some psychologists that had been trained in Indigenous culture, but I didn't realize that we were such a commodity. We're a moneymaker. And yeah, and this year it really, opened my eyes. And I thought, why am I, again, this colonial system? I think it's because of my age too. Learn late rather than never at all.
Yeah.
And I think because of intergenerational trauma, and also the lateral violence that I experienced with my own sexual assault experience here in my community. When I started trying to warn people about Nathan Chasing Horse, I kept myself anonymous. And the followers within my family had alerted other followers of Nathan's to harass me. And that's the only way they knew who I was. Other than that, even my community don't even know I've written this blog. I mean, I've kept myself anonymous. That being said, when we first had our interview, and when Nathan Chasing Horse got arrested, I was approached by different investigative reporters. And because I agreed to the interview, the epiphany of the transition from private to public really rocked my world. Because I had been depending so much on white psychologists to back me up. And when I sit on committees for the city of Calgary and we talk about anti-racism, and I say, well, I'm 71. They started fencing Sutina 71 years ago when my grandfather was chief. And even though we had industrial schools in the late 1800s, the Mohawks and the Six Nations and the people in Ontario, the Indigenous people, have had like at least 200 years more experience dealing with systemic racism. And so when we have newcomers coming into Calgary and they're not educated about systemic racism, it's very important that knowledge keepers and Indigenous elders talk about their experience, that there's a space. So I want to thank you, Michelle, for creating this space, because a lot of times when I talk to people, I say, it's the space. We get the comment from one of the knowledge keepers who has a PhD, had said that we're just overstudied. And so when I invited one of the investigators into my home, I smudged. And I said, this is the whole purpose. When we meet with the city or anybody, we smudge. And it could be any ceremony, pipe ceremony, but it has to be Indigenous. It can't be appropriated. It can't be adopted by non-Indigenous people to use it, because it's our history. It's our trauma. It's our way of healing from trauma. And anybody who's a psychologist, social worker, police, who think that they have this, magical wand because they know Marina Crane, or they know, some prestigious person off in the background. I'm going, no, there is no way. I know, I've lived in the States. I know I could never be white. I got 6% non-Indigenous. Anyway, that's another story.
Someone got raped somewhere. Just kidding.
Well, it's terrible, but the reality of it is true. And I'm skipping the subject, but systemic racism, especially when it comes to Black Americans, and just the stopping of slavery in the middle 1800s, and they said they stopped it because Europeans think like they're so sophisticated, and their like religious background says we are Christian and we stop slavery. And I'm going, no, you made farms, you bred people, you made slaves, you raped and pillaged.
Yep.
And so when you do the DNA of Black Americans and the Y chromosome that's passed on to their sons, 25 to 35% have European Y chromosome now instead of African. And when they do that same DNA test for Indigenous people, only 1% of Y chromosome from Black Americans passed to their sons. Mm. So even though they erase history, the proof is in the DNA.
Yeah.
And because a lot of times you have scholars trying to erase indigeneity.
Yes.
And saying, we are the first people, and I'm going, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And the reason why I mentioned Eastern Canada is because in Western Canada, we're unique. Um, my my father and mother traveled to South America and India only because the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi came through looking for trade in forest lumber. And then a lot of the third world countries in South America needed capitalism. So they said.
Yeah.
And they took my parents in under the umbrella of religiosity. And bless my parents' hearts, they preached it. And so and it was a horrible time. I mean, Mitch Bingham, Hiram Bingham, I think, or Mitch Bingham, one of them had uncovered Machu Picchu. And so my parents went there, and then my father was going down a copper mine, and it was all rickety. And Raj Mohan was impressed with my father's bravery, so he invited him to India 2 years later. And then that was the time when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, because the people were, scared about the atomic bomb. And my mother said, I looked out at the market, and she said, over the loudspeaker, they said what had happened. And she says, and everybody in the market just fell to the ground and started praying because they thought it was the end of the world.
Wow.
So things like that when my parents came back, and I was in the city of Calgary with kids my age, them calling me squaw, wagon burner, I said, we human sacrificed. Like, come on, you're dealing with an Indigenous person here who has a lot of anger. And I mean, really, if I can't get humor out of it, and that's the key thing too, is like, as Indigenous people, intergenerational trauma, we've learned to be comical.
Yeah.
And so when we're doing cross-cultural exchanges, especially with the city of Calgary and knowledge keepers and Indigenous elders, it's important that non-Indigenous people, and I mean, like, when I talk about humor, I know that it's in with Black people and other diverse cultures.
Yeah.
The European culture is totally different in how they handle trauma. Yeah. And for me, when I talk about trauma and I'm talking to a non-Indigenous person, it's like really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I say, well, if it triggers you, like I don't mean to have it triggered, but at the same time, when they say, oh, Marina, that's so bad, and I'm going, no, wait a minute. You're reflecting your life on me without even understanding how I exist.
Sure.
So when we have discussions and we say we create ceremony, we create safe spaces, those things are part of truth and reconciliation. Those things were taken away from us. When we allow a non-Indigenous person to dictate to us how our ceremonies run, how our artwork is supposed to be, how we are supposed to behave psychologically, then that's keeping us private, silencing us, like in your residential school. It's the shift from privacy to public. Now, I grew up, when my parents were in South America, I got ill, and my parents' friend was a teacher. I was in isolation in the Charles Kempsville Hospital. I did not know, and I did not understand the definition of the dome. Okay, there's a dome of safety when I'm around a white person, and it happens throughout my life, and I think that's why I gravitated to psychologists that were white, because it's like a safety thing, because it's an unconscious thing. When you're being attacked as an Indigenous person, if you're with a white person, this dome comes over and people start listening to you. Yeah. So in this hospital, they put me behind the nurse's desk, the doctor's desk, for safety, because I had white guardians. And I didn't realize, like about a few days before I was released, they put me in the dorm, and I was bullied because my English was so good. Anyway, that being said, the public realm is a difficult thing for Indigenous women who live in First Nations to be comfortable in. Yeah. Because the dome also means that you're married to an Indigenous man. And I spoke to a non-Indigenous friend of mine. She says, well, Marina, I have respect too for women who are married, and I'd sooner talk to the woman and for her to talk to the husband. She says, that's just human behavior, like all human beings. And I said to her, yes, however, understand this. People who live in the city can move. If somebody offends somebody or there's a divorce or something, people move. In Indigenous communities, we don't have that luxury.
Mhm.
How we cope with love medicine, bad medicine, your medicine being put on you. In those psychological terms, that's called infatuation, limerence, and love bombing.
Mhm.
Psychological terms that are so rampant on social media.
Mhm.
But yet, if you don't have critical thinking skills, then it sort of gets bastardized. And I
Mhm.
think that's probably why when they have cults, and you have a man like Nathan Chasing-Horse who recruited a lot of young people who had a lot of anger and hate
Yep.
based on systemic racism. They were so easy to be recruited,
Mhm.
and yet at the same time, the followers that he had a history of family violence. They had a history of maybe being vulnerable from they were FASE, or they had a mental illness, or they were hiding their sex crime within the sweats and Sundance. And so I try to say to people, he flourished because he moved. He was creating these domes all over, and he was taking the place of the colonial mindset, the white person. So he goes into different communities, and then people see this dome and say, oh, we can voice our opinion. But yet they don't realize they're victimizing because they're in this cult. They have this mind control, and they'll go to the point where they'll sacrifice their own lives for him. And it's such a despicable reality of how powerful our human minds are.
Sure.
And I say to people, we 94% of our brain capacity is on networking, and how critical we understand our own identity. Our identity is based on like 6%, like eating, sleeping, and sexual activity. That's it. The rest of it is networking.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I think part of what I like about you, Michelle, is the fact that you say, like, look, there's systemic racism, in the police system. There's systemic racism everywhere in the hospitals.
Yeah.
I didn't realize just how because I was so private
Yeah.
in my community that I didn't realize like all the issues that Black and other minorities have in the city of Calgary,
Sure.
and the fact that we have to have discussions on systemic racism and what it looks like. So the conversation that I brought up was that my niece had reported Nathan Chasing-Horse, and where are her records? I'd had various women approach me and saying, I thought you said he was, there was a warrant out for his arrest. And I said, no, I said he's a person of interest, because that's all Sutton had was a person of interest. And so since the podcast, I've been trying to get information from the city, and I just found out that they haven't found my niece's records. However, even the sexual assault unit won't disclose if any Indigenous women reported him, because they said if it's an active case, they can't. But understand this, if you have jurisdiction with the city of Calgary, the RCMP and tribal police, then where is the money and the capacity when you have Indigenous relations offices in the city of Calgary and in the police department in terms of safety? And we're talking safety of Indigenous girls and women.
Yeah.
And so when I say you have to have that approach of smudging ceremonies when you're talking with agencies within the city, because even though we have our people dying in those cities from drug overdose, from murder, they come home to our communities, our First Nations communities, and we bury them.
Yeah.
And we're having an epidemic right now this summer, more precedent than anything that we've ever felt or experienced, and yet the news media isn't picking it up.
No, I'm so disappointed with news media. And that's why I have the podcast, because, on every podcast, I talk about that issue. And I know for a lot of non-Indigenous, like they just don't get it. And so we're experiencing genocide ongoing, not just because of policies that were invented in the 1800s, because of policies of today that continue. I was flabbergasted by the mayor and by the city of Calgary that they took off the doors for the bus shelters at the Christmas time when it was minus 40. Like they want our people who are intergenerational trauma survivors of 60 Scoop and the Indian residential school to literally freeze to death and or have amputation. And I never thought I'd see the ugliest of humanity until that moment at Christmas time. And yet the average Calgarian, even though I've talked about it consistently, goes in one ear out the other. They do not care. And in fact, I think you and I know why. The sooner you and I and all of our people are eliminated, the sooner they can feel great about all the stolen land that there is and not actually ever accommodating us as part of the treaty holders. And I'm so disappointed with non-Indigenous people and all of the folks in leadership that are in these colonial parties and colonial governance when they have the opportunity to do so much and choose not to. And they squabble over the stupidest things. Like right now, today, we have Global Fest. Last night was the first night. Last night, they had these fireworks. It started some of the grass on fire. So emergency communities were in there, or fire departments and ambulance and such. Tens of thousands of people are leaving Elliston Park, and it looks like a zombie apocalypse. So somebody took a video, posted it on Twitter, and a friend of mine, and she said that this is what it looks like. This is what's happening. And somebody from Australia says, explain to me like I'm 5, why it is your country is completely on fire. You are evacuating people from major towns and you're still having fireworks. Like we have water restrictions in the city of Calgary right now. I have cousins that are coming all the way from Yellowknife to my uncle's. And we're just having fireworks, no biggie. Like nothing in this city makes a lick of sense from an Indigenous point of view. Nothing. Like I can't, there's not a decision they can make that doesn't seem racist and horrible and putting people's lives at danger. Like I can't think of anything that they're doing that is, they say it's for safety, but there's no safety. There's no safety anywhere.
There's a fellow, his last name's Achille Mbembe. He's a Black author from Africa, and he's quoted a word called necropolitics, where it sums up that society dictates who lives or who dies. And the reality of it is, like, when you have colonial states like Ghana who've been colonized, and yet the majority of the population is Black.
Yeah.
So they've had a history longer than Western Canada of systemic racism, and how they've seen how society dictates in their own country who lives and who dies. And yet here in Canada, when we say murdered and missing Indigenous women, or even policing, I reviewed the podcast, and like I said, there was a woman in politics last BC who just quit because there was no support from patriarchy.
Yep.
I know people can complain about feminism, but, excuse me, there are women dying. There are women being killed. There are women who are reporting sexual assault, and the police aren't doing anything. And I use my example, like 17 years ago, it was 27 years ago, it was a 25-year case. It took 25 years for me to go to court. 6 years of investigation. I went through 3 RCMP officers. I was a real bitch. Each one transferred or quit. And I was sitting on the women's emergency shelter, and I was associated with some non-Indigenous women who helped me through networking. And they sat me down and they said, Marina, when you go to court, the judge is not misogynist. The police are okay, and the lawyers. She said, we've done investigations from different provinces where they've come from. and there's no history of spousal abuse. And it shocked me. It shocked me that white society hides their own violence against women
Yeah.
without even talking about it. And then you wonder, well, why is it then that non-Indigenous women aren't owning it? Like for me, when people say, "Oh, Marina, you're strong," I'm going, no, I'm being strong because I'm dealing with trauma right now.
Yes.
I'm not being strong because I'm open to be loved and accepted. This is what trauma bonding is, or what trauma is. I'm owning it. Why can't other people that are not of color, that aren't Black or minorities, talking about it?
Yep.
Because I went to the RCMP commission, and within months, with the help of non-Indigenous women, they issued an arrest warrant. Like, it took that. So when I started my blog, and I knew, just because of the way Sutana Belize handled me, again, an Indigenous elder, understand this, I was 54, educated woman who lived away from in another country by myself, working.
Yeah.
It took the Sitchina police to come here to my home and apologize. We're sorry how we treated you. We should have called Nathan Chasing Horse ourselves, and we should have had him come in. You should have been kept anonymous. They apologized to me, and yet I'm saying no. What the heck? When we have a gauge of like in reality, he should have been brought in. Should have, would have, could have.
Mm-hmm.
It's all in the past now. It's on my blog.
Sure.
But the reality of it is that why I didn't have that dome. I didn't have a husband who's going to go down to the tribal police and say, you need to talk to my wife. No, that's why I'm talking. When I say I'm an Indigenous woman, I may look strong, but I sacrificed a lot, and I outlived a lot of people. It took my resilience. I don't want to use the word resilience because I think that's a colonial term. Because most people, in terms of feminism too, it's in a society where they don't believe their society or community is a living organism.
Yep.
Like, when you talk about the environment and how people don't see the world as a living organism, but if you start off within your home and your community, and you see how just the energy that you have has a ripple effect. So, I mean, as much as the hoodoo voodoo magic of Nathan Chasing Horse and his ability to have his followers sing sacred songs and put medicine in the smudge so the people who are attending get high, and they hallucinate, and he indoctrinates them, saying no. It's like he doesn't even mention drugs, but yet here are these innocent, vulnerable people thinking that that he has communication with the dead, that he has communication with the grandfathers and grandmothers, and yet he has no community. Like in order to have that connection with the ancestors, you have to know the people who came before you. And the only way you know that is when you live in a community where you grow up and you live until the end of your time. That's why when people practice, they want to practice sweats and sundowns. And I'm going, if you don't live in a First Nations community where people hold you accountable for you throughout your whole life, then why are you doing it? And if they need to recover from trauma, I'll say, go ahead. Mm-hmm. It's a long journey. Look at me. I'm 71 years old. It took me until this year to transition into the public self.
Marina, I have to just totally back off of what you're saying and agree with you. So because I'm an Indigenous woman in a white supremacist society, I've had to constantly focus on this issue of racism in order to heal. So I've kind of gotten to know a few different creators that are women of color. And I just recently got onto an email of Ginzel Allen. I just forwarded you this email because this came on my email this morning, and it is so good. she says, I bet sometimes it feels like no matter what you do, people in your life insist on assigning you the role of the strong one, the resilient one, superwoman, superhuman. But I see you because I am you. You are soft, vulnerable, sensitive, tired as fuck of carrying the weight of the world. But for some reason, it feels like no one sees that or cares about it, no matter how hard you try. Folks very rarely ask if you need support and just assume you've got it. Even worse, most folks expect you to take care of them. Let's talk about why. It's because of this layered deep with white supremacy. Let's start with how people perceive you. As a person of color, white supremacy has presented a narrative that presents you as having less needs. Over time, even folks of color have internalized these narratives, and that's why our loved ones assume that we are self sufficient and have no needs. So let's talk about how your generational trauma plays into why you're not getting the support you need. As a person of color, you are used to not having your needs met in systemic ways. POC communities have been starved of things like equity, safety, justice, dignity, housing, money, and the list goes on. You have developed a trauma response of being extremely independent. You take care of everything. And here's the real kicker. Sometimes likely you need to protect other people from your sadness, neediness, and vulnerability because you don't want them to worry or be inconvenienced. So, long story short, thanks to generational of racial and gendered based trauma, you can prioritize other people's needs over your own. And it talks about how white supremacy has just set us up for failure. It goes on and on. So, like, just to, like, I hope amplify your message that you just said and why it is that this is so complex when trying to bring a spiritual cult leader to justice when we've never experienced justice and we are so like there's so many barriers for us to ever get that justice. So I just hope that amplifies what you're saying and gives you like that understanding, like that credibility, because other women of color are going through this as well. Of course, my biggest pet peeve with the equity, diversity, and inclusion, world is that they don't come from a decolonized point of view. So they don't see themselves as treaty partners, and they don't see this as stolen land, and they don't see as, working together with Indigenous people as, the treaty partners. So that's my criticism of that world. But the upside is that, we really are in this together. And I've, forwarded that to other women of color in my life that are, I think, leaders in this conversation of like racial conversations that we're trying to dismantle systemic barriers with. I don't know if we are, frankly. I get pretty disappointed. Yeah.
I agree, because I mean, after I did the interviews, I thought I became obsessed, and then I started doing my daily prayers and saying, please protect these people who I'm in contact with. Protect them against me. Because like all that systemic or the intergenerational trauma,
Yeah.
I'm aware of it. And yet like that's what I'm trying to say is like, because of the awareness, I'm vulnerable. So it's okay to be vulnerable. And that's why I said, okay, I won't I entered into a relationship. When this crew came into my home, I smudged. I cannot go back on that, no matter how hard I fight against myself, my like whatever trauma things that I'm engaging in on a daily basis, like isolation, grieving, chronic stress, triggers that trigger limerence, triggers that trigger love bombing. Yeah. Like those things, unless you actually have had guidance to maneuver through these potholes of difficulty, and each time you hit a pothole, unless you have those skills, then you're going to be wallowing in those potholes of sorrow. And that's what our youth are going through.
Yes.
Our youth are hitting those potholes and they're dying.
Yes.
They're like during the month of July, my sister lost her two in-laws in their 50s, a brother and sister. My
Oh,
friend lost her brother and sister-in-law again in their 50s, both from drug overdoses.
oh
We,
no.
we've had so much death,
Yeah,
and even Kainai, they've lost so many people. And then on the Blackfeet in Montana,
yeah,
like 2 to 3 people a week they're burying.
I
My
know.
friend is dying in Toronto.
Oh,
Beautiful man. Every time I go to meetings in public art, he'd validate me. He'd create this dome of safety for me, and everybody would listen. Everybody would have to listen because he's providing this for me out of respect. And I try and tell people, I moved from I had no dome my whole life because I've never been married. I don't have kids. As I've moved into elder statehood, all of a sudden this respect, this dome is placed. Now here's this young man dying. I call his mother. She says, because I think he might recover. And they did a GoFundMe. And they have to do a GoFundMe because the blood reserve has no money. They've been using it to bury their people.
yeah,
Heartbreaking that his mother has to be here in Alberta when her son is in Toronto. And I say, the respect that as an artist, an Indigenous young artist, to understand this dome of safety. That's what our young people are missing, those
yes,
teachings.
yes.
And one of the, when I don't mean to trigger people, but I know my friend told me, take care of yourself,
Yeah.
paint or do something. But again, I say, people don't get it. They may react to me and say, oh, gee, something's the matter with her. Again, the stereotypes of what they think Indigenous women are, or what Indigenous communities are, or even the stereotype, oh, she's strong. And I'm going, you got to apply it to yourself. You cannot judge me unless you're looking at yourself in terms of you having had limerence or you having been love bombed. And how do you deal with this? You can move to another neighborhood.
Yeah.
In our communities, we live here. We have to live with this generation after generation, growing up and saying, oh, how did that person meet that person? Oh, they were medicines. like the whole nature of how to interpret, behavior that's not healthy.
Yeah.
We have that in our communities, but yet people want to re-examine it. Like I said, therapists and psychologists and policemen and lawyers that aren't Indigenous coming into our community thinking they have the answer, and they're trying to make money off of us.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't realize that that's a subtle way of love bombing. And for me, being public and having people that I've developed relationship with 10 to 20, 30 years, I've had to walk away from as a lesson that I've had to learn because of this blog and the podcast that I had.
Sure.
It's the reality of what's out there for our young people. I'm like I've had a life experience. I've got some knowledge, and I can walk through this. But the young people who have to put up with the systemic racism and just those barriers. When I was talking about just being in infancy when it comes to systemic racism, as opposed to the Black Africans coming into Canada, or the Black Americans from the United States. I'm really humbled in the sense that I do feel very young and naive when there's so much of culture in our communities. When we bury someone, the community comes together.
Yeah.
And then in New Orleans, like they have parades to the cemetery, parades saying you've gone through this life of racism and systemic racism. The next life you don't have to live like this. They're celebrating their life, that they don't have to live through this racism. And that's the reality. But yet non-Indigenous people are looking at it as like, oh, jazz, oh, music, or oh, rock and roll. I mean, even Robbie Robinson, who passed away, and just the fact that, his mom says, be careful who you tell that you're Indigenous. And that's the thing. When I become public and whatever I say, that fear was in me, 4 months ago.
Sure.
And I'm going, I don't need to have that anymore. I don't need to be afraid of how a person thinks about me. When I die, people may mourn me a week, a month. Within a year, I'm gone. And so why am I worried about what non-Indigenous people think about me when it comes to this blog? And for me, trying to step up and save young girls and women, and trying to say to them, if I had the courage after 25 years to take the man who raped me to court, you can do it too.
Yeah.
If I had the courage to fight the police to gather information, you can do it too. If I had the courage to try and find support out there, invisible helping hands from other women that aren't Indigenous, you can do it too. It's amazing, like that all of a sudden, because he was arrested, people started noticing me. I'm going, why? This problem has been here before I was even born. Just the murdering and killing. My one of my grandmothers was killed. She was pregnant, fighting. She fell on her knife. There's a town in South Dakota that was created because white settlers were scalping pregnant Indigenous women to get 2 scalps. Where's that history in the history books? Just
Right.
like I mentioned, just what I mentioned about ending slavery. Those history books and all the hundreds of thousands of Black people and Indigenous people who died,
Yes.
are all covered by colonizers.
Yep.
Like I say, even you look at the Roman Empire, they came into England and they colonized England. Then what happened? The English started colonizing and became the greatest colonizers on the face of the earth. And here we are as Indigenous people. We have to think. We cannot become colonizers. How many prayers of our ancestors have we lived through so we will not become colonizers? Creator didn't ask us. They didn't teach us about money or greed. We what we lived and how we prayed. And I tell people, Nathan Cheesenhorse practiced spirituality. There's a thing called spiritual activism that all human beings need to practice. When you practice that, then you're helping save another human being. And that's why when he came into our community, and because of the way I was raised, I thought because of spiritual activism, he was fighting to save lives. And the fact that he destroyed my niece's life, that he's destroyed some girls' lives in this community, and continued for 17 years. And even before that, he was destroying girls. And breaking up families in California. And to this day, there are still people who believe he's innocent. Since he was arrested, I've had fears that, the FBI or the people in the States are going to set him free. Again, why? Because Indigenous women don't mean nothing. We're hunted. It's a shame. It's a shame. And that's why when I say, look at Tsuut'ina police, they put in more charges against him. But that's because we have historical records. What about the other Indigenous people in the Treaty 7 area or even within the city? Who has documentation of that? If they don't have any documentation, then that's proof we don't mean anything. That
Right.
means we're invisible. That's the sad reality of it. That's why.
And you're right. And that's why I tried to read that piece about our, we don't experience justice. So we are expected to do so many things. And, given these racist tropes, like we're so resilient, when it's like, we're resilient because you're so racist. because of your white supremacy, because of your lack of equality, your lack of justice that you are affording, because they dehumanize us. They can't even file our reports. Like, it's maddening. It is maddening. We're trying to encourage these women to stand up for themselves, and these damn police can't even take and make a file. Of course, we're invisible. I echo your statements.
Well, even look at the landfill. My cousin's son disappeared. He could be there.
Yeah.
When we're trying to say to people genocide's happening,
yeah,
their ears, they lose their ability to hear. And even as much as we sing and yell and scream, they can't hear us.
Yeah.
They say we're listening, but you're not hearing what we're saying.
No,
I block your children.
Yeah, I block a lot of those folks who think they're allies because they won't do anything. Like simple things to complex things.
Yes.
If I get them to read a book, they think that they go like this for about the rest of their life. I read a book once about a native. It's like, fuck, right off. We have girls that are in landfills. We have kids that are in our landfills. And you're happy you read a book? Yay for you.
See, the thing that really frustrated me after I did we did the podcast, was the reflection of how many mental health workers Nathan Chasing Horse was around. And just the fact that the non-Indigenous mental health workers wanted to have a relationship with him. Why? So they could learn how to smudge. They could learn a song of how to do ceremony. Non-Indigenous people categorizing, other, like, these victims as having, they're in limerence, they're infatuated, they've got this intergenerational trauma. They want to show him off as a boyfriend. They did that. They did that because why? They wanted to go to non-insured health benefits and say, look, I know what it is to be Indigenous because I have Indigenous friends. Just like you say, I have this book I've read.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's so disgusting. That's what's so disgusting to me. And the reality of it is, yes, I did study psychology. I do have an education. I do have a voice. Yeah. If I didn't have that, Michelle, I could have easily said to those men who interviewed me, forget it. I could have easily said that. That's why it hurts me so much. Because I hope they understand that. Yeah. It's not a question of my wanting any kind of fame or glory. Mm-hmm. I have no choice. There are people, young people dying.
I know.
They're dying.
They don't understand the odds that we're up against. And like for me, I mean, I put my neck out there, and I talked to the CBE about a predatory elder. And they act as if I never talked to them. And I put my neck out for that. And that elder is still around children today. And I'm disgusted with the amount of people that know, that we've told, the mother told. Until they see a police report, they can't do anything. So they're just going to allow this predator to continue in that system. Well, and so we stick our neck out. And for what? The police won't file reports. The CBE won't take out a predatory elder. Like, we are, and why are we doing it? Not for fame, because we need these kids to be protected. And here we are. We're still going through this.
Well, part of the knowledge keepers and Indigenous elders were saying, we're sitting here at this meeting. Are our grandchildren going to be sitting here in this meeting doing the same thing we're doing?
Yep.
Because believe me, my grandparents were doing the same thing I'm doing now. And because nobody's taking action.
No.
And then they say, yeah.
I was so angry when they did I think it was like 3 days of the city listening to people of color talk about the racism in the city, because what that said to me was, one, they couldn't read our books that told them that this was happening. Two, your grandparents, you my grandkids are going to say the same thing to them over and over, and it's going to go in one ear and out the other. They're not going to act upon it. So when we sit at these tables and they ignore our grandparents, us, it just shows us that we don't matter. We are invisible to them and they don't care.
Yeah, to me, I think Nathan Chasing Horse, like I said, he created this dome in the communities he went to.
Yeah.
I think he got so comfortable that when he started living in Nevada, like it took him actually to stay in one place for them to catch him.
Mm.
And it took 17 years for his victims to have the courage to say something.
Yeah.
That's why for me, it was 25 years, 21 years before I wrote a report. And then even then, like how many women these serial rapists victimized,
yeah.
who as older than me, who are still in that private self, who will never go from private to public.
Yeah.
Because they're frozen in fear of their husbands relatives, family violence, and whatever ritual abuse they've encountered in like residential schools, 60 scoop foster homes.
Yeah.
Like that's the reality of just the legacy of the people who came before us. And the reality of it is, by dealing with our own emotional work, honors those who came before us.
Yes. Yes.
And that's why I said, when I look at myself and I see what I've done, and I say, that's why I say to Creator, protect those people who I've come in contact with.
Yeah.
I don't mean to hurt them. And that's not even, Michelle, that's not even physical. That's not even verbal. I'm asking for protection at a spiritual level, spiritual activism, yeah. Fighting and healing against white supremacy.
Yes.
So I appreciate, how you've shared your time with me. And as much as Nathan's coming to court on the 23rd, and I know my blog is going to be bombarded by people, I've tried to do a lot of cross-cultural essays, to try and help educate people who will actually read and hear what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It isn't for the lack of not being educated. It isn't for the lack of not being around non-Indigenous people. My whole life, I didn't have to be married to a white man or a black man or Asian or an American or whatever religion, Catholic, Mormonism, Jewish. Didn't have to. It's just the reality of my own struggle, and it's just me. But I sure hope that young people will just not give up. My late mother, tried to commit suicide a couple of times. And when she started talking about Indian residential school, even how she'd project her anger and hate towards me, she'd say to me, she says, I see it, I hear it coming out of my mouth and I can't stop myself. She says, I know this affected me in my marriage. Like, she had that insight. And she was an elder. And I try and tell people that. She would pray and she'd say to me, she said, the Creator wants us to fight and heal.
Yes.
We can't end our lives because other people are depending on us. Yes. I'd say to my mom, you had it rough. My grandmother had it hard. She was 5 years old when she ran away from Mankato, Minnesota. And then my great grandmother in her 30s, watching those men hang, running away, seeing their relatives bob-wired around trees with grasshoppers eating their eyes out because settlers killed them. Then now we have Boucher in Saskatchewan
Yeah.
being hunted by a farmer.
Yeah.
We have a young woman in Calgary who was cut up in pieces. We have another woman in Edmonton whose sexual organs were taken out. Yeah. Like what? Yeah. They talk about history of Jack the Ripper and all these, yeah, horrible people, yet it's happening.
Right.
We don't have the 18th century, 17th century, early 1900s.
Imagine
happening.
All the shock and hate and horror towards the folks that are on the C train. Imagine if they put half of that energy to all of this violence that we as Indigenous people and BIPOC in general experience. Imagine if they had that sense of outrage and injustice, but because they can't drink their timis on the way on the C train, they're like, oh, we got to get rid of everybody and throw them in jails. And yet they're okay with part of Joey English being in the landfill. They're okay with a farmer killing Colton Boucher. They're okay with a young man out at Siksika being murdered. Like I'm so sick of this, and a special shout out to Cindy Gladju's family. When that happened, that was the moment of like I knew I was never going to be safe in Canada, but that was the moment I was like, even after death, I will never be safe. They will likely rip me open, chop me up, and use me as an exhibit, put me in a museum somewhere to be forgotten. Like, it's disgusting, these people, what they do to us.
Like Jim Thorpe.
Yes.
What they did with Jim Thorpe's body. And all the hundreds and thousands of bones in the Smithsonian. The truth, when they say truth and reconciliation, are they ready for the truth?
No.
And how are they going to reconcile the thousands of years from the time the Romans conquered them for them to become colonizers? At what point did they stop to think we're no better than the Romans? Right. At what point do they say all those foundations of Aristotle and all those racist thinkers that made the foundations of the universities here? What is going to happen to, like, I had when I was young, I thought I was so proud about what the word civilization meant. Now I'm 71 and I'm going, I pray for those people who have a different way of dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
Our Indigenous people have lived in this land, healing with the animals. We've been living with a living organism. Everything we live with, Creator has designed for us. But yet, when you have a colonial way of thinking, that we are not connected, that we don't mean anything, somewhere, somehow, it's going to take so much. Look at the fires in Maui. Yeah. Look at all the things that are happening in this world. And it was told in prophecy, White Buffalo Calf Woman, 13 generations ago, this was going to happen. That's why no matter how they want to look at Indigenous people, let them look at us. If Creator has given us these gifts, this spiritual activism for thousands of years, don't they think that Creator's still going to watch us? I had my cousin say what police in Brandon, Manitoba said to my nephew, here, take this, see what your Creator is going to do with it. So I'm just hoping, as much as it hurts my heart that as a human, that Nathan Chasing-Horse is no longer a human being, that he's turned into a monster. In white society, they're going to put him away for life. That's how they deal with people like that. Yes, that's the fairy tale. Whether or not it happens, Whether or not it happens is another thing, but I do really believe that hopefully what we've talked about in this podcast will reach Indigenous girls and women, and they'll realize like they've been fighting and healing from white supremacy ever since they knew about him.
Yes.
And we've been networking amongst each other as sisters.
Yes. Yes.
And
Thank you.
My sister said to me, she says, Marina, you have a different energy than I do. But I like I said, with this spiritual activism, you have to sacrifice. So the sacrifice I made, that's why I say I pray to those who I've been in contact with. I ask Creator to protect them from me. Because it's a very powerful message that Creator has given me to tell people.
Yeah.
And if it took that sacrifice of my life, then don't they understand? Generation after generation, our people have been asking for these things in prayer, just as I've done.
Yes.
I'm no different than those who came before me. So thank you, Michelle.
I'm so honored, Marina. And, my mother-in-law passed away, so I'm in your area quite a bit recently. So we'll have to get together here, and know, again, you can reach out to me anytime, because talking about these things is hard. It hurts. And that's part of the reason why I forwarded that email to you, so that you can see these things and know that, as you said, we are a sisterhood in love and solidarity, and we have to help each other and protect each other. So I'm honored you would come on and talk about this on Native Calgarian, because it is so incredibly difficult for us as Indigenous women to talk about sexual assault, child abuse. And I just hope I hope that we are inspiring somebody somewhere. I've heard, people willing to buy a mortgage, because I had a guy who talked about, he was a realtor who's Native on. So, that inspiration, I hope, is what's going to go out there. And I'm going to give that preamble in the hopes that, a message to our young Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. We love you. And this gendered violence and racism you are experiencing is total colonialism. So thank you for being on my show, Marina.
Well, thank you for having me and guiding me in this direction. I don't know if you understand, like, you creating a dome of safety for me has made me realize, like, I did a lot of work, and it's okay for me now to enjoy the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Travel, paint, the effort of holding space for Nathan Chasing Horse to be accountable is done and over.
And you've carried that flag and that burden for too long, and I hate that you had to do it alone, and worse, experience so much violence, even from our own, over it. So I'm honored to walk this journey with you, even if it's just for a short, brief moment in the incredible journey you've had. So thank you, Marina. And we'll connect here right after. So, and you're welcome back anytime as we go, as this case unfolds and such.
Yes.
And, we'll talk about pieces of it as you need, and as we should all unpack it. So thank you, Marina.
You're welcome.
Okay, and I'm going to do my exit. You're welcome to join in. Okay. For folks who don't know, I do run an Indigenous book club, and it is meant more for settlers or Indigenous people trying to learn, or just wanting to share a book with folks who are reading what we're reading. And I think it's important that everyone reads reports. So September 11th, we're starting with the Pathways to Justice from the Alberta government, the 113 Pathways to Justice, and that's a provincial look at the national inquiry's work, and see what they said and see what we can hold them accountable for. October 9th is Cree lawyer Harold Johnston's book, Peace and Good Order, The Case for Indigenous Justice. As you just heard, we don't get any, so maybe there's something good in that. November 13th, a report to guide the implementation of a national action plan on violence against women and gendered-based violence. Now, This upsets me quite a bit because non-Indigenous need a non-Indigenous report when we have an Indigenous report that helps Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but we're going to ignore that one to focus on this non-Indigenous one. But whatever, we're going to read it. December 11th, we're going to talk about making space for Indigenous feminism as edited by Joyce Green. So my hope is that we will get some inspiration from that too. The Reconciliation Action Group has we had our first kind of get together here recently, and it was absolutely lovely to finally get to meet some folks. And so for folks who are not from Calgary, there should be a reconciliation committee somewhere in your life that you can join and be a part of, doing actual action instead of just sitting around and going, oh my God, I feel sorry for natives, because that's not helping no one. Anyway, I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions, included cultural safety training, a cultural first aid, and all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous people of color, those with disabilities, and to us LGBTQ to speak. I want to say thank you to authors Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of heretohelp.bc.ca. They have What is Indigenous Cultural Safety and Why I Should Care About It. Their work are those cultural action tools, so please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understanding. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism and lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized people experience by the structure of systemic racism imposed on these lands. If you can donate or go to racialequitytools.org, it is free. They have resource files on what is internalized racism by Donna Bevins. But if you are a settler, it'd be really great for you to help support some BIPOC content creators. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee. So you can go to afsc.org and type in the bystander. There's tons of resources there to help people. So tired of this. Just a shout out to Montgomery, Alabama, where that Black fellow who was a security guard was trying to get these white folks to move. And you know who showed up? Other Black people for him. Thank God. Now, there are other ways to nonviolently do it. I just gave you a resource. But at the end of the day, white people, you're not showing up. I do wish anyone who follows me on my social medias would watch the anti-racism organizational lead for the city of Calgary giving an internal committee presentation on the journey of becoming an anti-racism leader. Again, truth and reconciliation can't work if you don't take anti-racism training. Here's another free resource for you. The Calgary Black Lives Matter activists Taylor McNally and Adora Nofor are being legally targeted. There are GoFundMes. If you can donate, please donate to them. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties, listen to politicians. If they don't recognize marginalized folks or equity seeking groups in their budget with gender equity seeking or gender equity plus, if they're cutting violence prevention programs, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, a lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, or folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that person or party directly negatively impacts equity seeking groups. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and the multiple reports about child welfare reform and violence prevention. Now we have 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry. Provincially, we have the 113 pathways to justice. Locally, we have the White Goose Flying Report. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in every institution with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, treaty partnership, racism, privilege, sexism, they have zero business writing. Should be understood by all parties, politicians, community organizations, business groups, sports clubs. Google articles on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies, because there's actually tons of them out there. Stephanie Harp and I had an emergency podcast in the hopes we could get our allies to write and do more on the crises that we are facing. You can go to aboriginalalert.ca and sign up to get notifications of Indigenous people that are missing in our area all across the country. You can also download an app for the Missing Children Society of Canada. There is a great statement that came out from the womenshomelessness.ca, a demand for urgent action to protect the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit experiencing homelessness. We have a huge drug crisis with an unsafe supply thanks to decisions made by policy. So you're not holding your politicians to account to allow this to continue. And both Marina and I talked about it for a moment. If you know or you are using substances, please do not use alone. If you are using alone, you can create a safety plan at National Overdose Response Service at 1-888-688-NORS. There are also some apps that you can use, the Brave, the Doors, and the Lifeguard app. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talk about today and need to talk, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. You can also go to hopeforwellness.ca. And for immediate emotional assistance on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call this toll-free 24/7 crisis line at 844-413-6649. There's also 60 Scoop Society of Alberta at ssisa.ca. You can call the Indian Residential Schools and Family Hotline at 866-925-4419, the Native Youth Crisis Hotline at 877-209-1266. For non-Indigenous, there's usually a functioning 211 in your area, or you can call at 833-456-4566 or text at 45645. If you go to crisisservicescanada.ca, you can actually even get more. The Kids Help Phone, 1-800-668-6868. If you identify as Two-Spirit or 2S LGBTQ in general, there are lots of resources available for you as well. Huge shout out to the Trevor Project for Youth, 866-844-7386. Trans Lifeline in Canada is 877-330-6366. And you can go to lifevoice.ca, and they have tons of crisis supports for folks as well. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self-care, how I take my power back, how we get some Indigenous voices at the table in a colonial system of media that's never allowed it. This is why I started the podcast, to speak freely, without interruption, without tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinions, but they sure like to tell us theirs, and usually by people who know nothing about Indigenous people, know nothing about colonialism, know nothing about the constant surveillance of our people, our protests and our vigils and our rights. I and many others share about racism daily, so it's just unacceptable anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism, gatekeepers, and folks just stopping things from being able to get done. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, Indigenous people, folks with disabilities, QT, BIPOC, and more. Masi Cho to my ancestors, to my granny, to my mom, of what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is with her Austrian family and roots, and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. To my husband, Darcy, he has spent hours encouraging me, being there for me, producing and editing this show, being my husband, our childhood friend, father of my child, support down my journey of this red road, and has witnessed decades of racism and sexism. To our child, Thunderpipe Necklace Woman, I am so blessed and honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. My hope is that my daughter, my family will be proud in the future of us discussing these present day issues in the way that they can down the road. So today again is the 18th, and my family is just being evacuated from Yellowknife, and we have some cousins that are here in Calgary, some that are in Red Deer, and some that are in Edmonton. And I have a really hard time seeing all these non-Indigenous people say things like, "Oh my God, thoughts and prayers for all of you because you are the reason why this is happening. Our people have told you about climate change, and now all of my people are at risk because of your choices when it comes to this capitalist economy. All those people in Maui that passed because of your choices of colonialism in Hawaii. I have no respect for your thoughts and prayers when you're a non-Indigenous person not lifting a finger for this issue that we're faced with now. It is our people that is taking the brunt of your privileges, and the fact you don't see it. Anyway, my hope is that we can move everybody that needs to get moved down here in a safe way. Anyway, my Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, or you can send in your comments or questions. I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. You can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And I want to end by giving a side eye to those beautiful Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not tradish. And my beautiful cousin responded, "Are you being my dish?" Thank you so much, folks, for listening.